In 1909, in Sigmund Freud's study in Vienna, Carl Jung and Freud were deep in an argument. Neither of them was winning, when a sharp crack came from the bookcase against the wall, loud enough that both men stopped talking. Freud said it was nothing. Old wood, contracting in the evening air. Jung said it would happen again. Seconds later, it did. Freud brushed it off. Jung couldn't. He'd been noticing moments like this for years. Two events with no physical connection to each other, arriving together in a way that felt too precise to be nothing. This was the moment that finally pushed him to name it. He called it synchronicity, meaningful coincidence. Not fate, not superstition. A specific, deliberate theory about why the mind keeps finding significance in moments that logic says shouldn't have any. It's an idea that's divided serious thinkers for over a century. And once you understand what Jung actually meant by it, it's hard to look at coincidence the same way again. Before going any further, it's worth being precise about what Jung actually meant by synchronicity, because the term has drifted a long way from his original definition. In everyday use now, synchronicity gets applied to almost any coincidence at all. Running into someone you were just thinking about. Seeing a number repeatedly. Anything that feels vaguely fated. That loose, popularized version isn't really what Jung meant, and it's worth setting aside before we go further. Jung's actual definition was narrower and more specific. Synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence between an inner psychological state and an outer event, where the two are connected by significance rather than by cause and effect. That last part matters enormously. Jung wasn't claiming the beetle at the window caused the dream, or that the bookcase crack was caused by the argument in the room. He was explicit that there was no physical, causal link between the two halves of the pattern at all. What connected them, in his view, wasn't cause and effect. It was meaning. The two events lined up around the same idea at the same moment, without one producing the other. This distinction is the whole reason Jung felt he needed a new term in the first place. Standard science, then and now, explains the world almost entirely through cause and effect. One thing happens, and it produces the next thing. Jung's clinical observations kept running into moments that didn't fit that model cleanly. Two events, unconnected in any causal sense, that still seemed to be organized around a shared meaning. Rather than force those moments into a causal explanation that didn't really fit, or dismiss them outright as noise, he proposed a second parallel principle alongside causality. One based on meaningful connection instead of physical cause. It's important to say clearly here that this is not a settled or universally accepted idea. Synchronicity is genuinely one of the most contested concepts in Jung's entire body of work, and the criticism is substantive, not just casual skepticism. The central objection is that synchronicity, as Jung described it, is largely unfalsifiable. There's no clear test that could prove it false, because almost any coincidence can be retroactively described as meaningful once you're already looking for the pattern. Critics argue that what feels like synchronicity is really a demonstration of ordinary human psychology. We're pattern-seeking by nature. We remember the hits and forget the misses. And a coincidence that lines up with something already on our mind gets flagged as significant, while the enormous number of coincidences that don't line up with anything simply pass unnoticed. This is a serious, well-reasoned criticism, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than waved away. Jung's response to this kind of objection was more careful than the popularized version of his idea usually gives him credit for. He wasn't arguing that every coincidence is meaningful, or that the universe is constantly sending personal messages. He was specifically interested in a narrower category: coincidences that arrive at moments of unusual psychological intensity, often tied to significant unconscious material, dreams, or emotionally charged states, and that carry enough specificity that a purely random explanation starts to feel strained, at least to the person experiencing it. He treated these as clinically interesting phenomena worth taking seriously as data, not as proof of anything mystical or supernatural in a literal sense. It's also worth understanding why this idea mattered so much to Jung specifically, beyond simple intellectual curiosity. It connected directly to a much larger claim in his work, that the unconscious mind isn't purely internal and separate from the world around it, but is, in some way, he never fully resolved to his own satisfaction, connected to it. If synchronicity is genuinely real, in whatever sense Jung meant, the obvious practical question is, how do you actually tell it apart from ordinary coincidence, the kind that's just your brain doing what brains do, spotting patterns in noise? This is where casual discussion of the idea falls apart, because everything happens for a reason, and Jung's actual, careful concept are not the same thing, even though they get treated as interchangeable. Jung offered real criteria, and they're worth taking seriously because they separate a thoughtful engagement with this idea from the vague, everything-is-connected version most people have encountered. The first is specificity, a vague coincidence. Thinking about cats in general and then seeing a cat carries very little weight because cats are common. The cases Jung found compelling involved a high degree of specificity, not an insect showing up, but a beetle closely resembling the exact image being described in a dream at the exact moment it was being described. The more specific and improbable the overlap, the more it moves out of the range of ordinary expected coincidence. The second is psychological intensity. Jung's clearest cases arrived alongside significant emotional or unconscious material, a dream carrying real symbolic weight, an argument touching something genuinely unresolved, a period of major life transition. This mattered to his broader theory. He believed synchronicity tended to surface when unconscious material was especially active, as though heightened psychological states made these connections more likely to occur, or at least more likely to be noticed. A coincidence during an emotionally flat moment carries much less weight in his framework than one arriving during real psychological significance. The third, and probably the most important for separating genuine engagement from wishful thinking, is honest acknowledgement of the base rate problem. Given how many events happen in a single day, some coincidental overlaps are mathematically guaranteed to occur purely by chance, with no explanation needed beyond probability. A rigorous approach to synchronicity has to account for this rather than ignore it. Jung didn't have modern statistics to draw on, but more careful modern discussions of his work grapple with this directly. The fact that a coincidence happened doesn't automatically make it meaningful in Jung's specific sense. It has to clear a real bar of specificity and improbability, not just feel surprising in the moment. Here's a practical way to apply this yourself, without pretending to more certainty than the idea supports. When something coincidental happens, instead of immediately labeling it either just chance or definitely meaningful, it's worth asking a few honest questions. How specific was the overlap, really? Or am I rounding two loosely related things into a tighter match than they actually are? Was I in an unusually charged emotional or psychological state when it happened? Or was it an ordinary moment I'm retroactively dressing up? And critically, how many similar near misses have I simply not noticed or remembered because they didn't line up as neatly? That last question matters more than people usually give it credit for. Human memory is selective in a specific way. We remember confirming instances vividly and forget disconfirming ones almost immediately. which is exactly the mechanism critics point to when they argue synchronicity is really just a demonstration of memory bias rather than anything genuinely mysterious. Taking that criticism seriously doesn't mean synchronicity is definitely nothing. It means honest engagement holds both possibilities at once. Some of what feels like synchronicity probably is ordinary pattern seeking, and Jung himself would likely agree with that for the majority of everyday coincidences. What he was pointing to was a narrower, rarer category, cases specific and psychologically loaded enough that the ordinary explanation starts to feel genuinely strained, even to a careful, skeptical observer. That distinction between the common, low-stakes coincidences that are almost certainly just chance and the rarer, more specific cases Jung actually built his theory around, is the difference between engaging with his real idea and repeating the watered-down version that's become popular online. The next question worth asking is why Jung thought this mattered so much in the first place, what he believed it revealed about the relationship between the conscious mind and the unconscious, and why he considered it one of the most important ideas of his career, even knowing how contested it would be. Given how contested synchronicity was, even in his own lifetime, it's worth asking why Jung pursued it as seriously as he did. He wasn't a careless thinker, and he understood exactly how much professional risk came with proposing an idea this far outside mainstream scientific explanation. The answer connects to something much larger in his work than a handful of interesting anecdotes. Jung's broader theory of the psyche rested on a distinction between the personal unconscious, the individual material specific to your own life, the kind involved in shadow work, and what he called the collective unconscious, a deeper layer he believed was shared across all human beings, expressed through recurring symbols and patterns he called archetypes. This was already a controversial claim on its own. Synchronicity extended it further, into genuinely unusual territory. Jung came to believe that the psyche wasn't sealed off from the physical world in the way most scientific models assumed. If the unconscious could, in certain intensified states, connect meaningfully with external events that suggested something about the relationship between mind and world that standard causality couldn't fully capture. This is where Jung's collaboration with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli becomes relevant, and it's worth mentioning because it shows Jung wasn't developing this idea in isolation from serious scientific thought. Pauli, a Nobel laureate and one of the founders of quantum mechanics, took Jung's ideas seriously enough to correspond with him extensively and co-author work exploring possible connections between synchronicity and the strange, probabilistic behavior physicists were discovering at the quantum level. This collaboration doesn't prove synchronicity is real. Quantum mechanics operates at a scale entirely disconnected from everyday coincidences, and using it to validate synchronicity is a move many physicists consider a category error. But it does establish that Jung's thinking here wasn't dismissed by every serious scientist of his era. It drew genuine interest from one of the most respected physicists alive at the time, even as most of his own colleagues in psychology remained skeptical. For Jung personally, synchronicity mattered because it addressed something he found genuinely inadequate about a purely mechanistic, causal view of existence. He wasn't arguing against science or causality generally. He used causal explanation throughout the rest of his work without objection. His specific claim was narrower, that causality, however well it explains most of reality, might not be a complete account of everything that happens, and that meaning itself might be a real, if rare and hard to formalize, organizing principle alongside it. It's worth being fair to the skeptical position here too, because a full picture requires it. Many philosophers of science argue that even if synchronicity describes something real about human psychological experience, the intense, memorable feeling of a meaningful coincidence, that doesn't require positing any actual causal connection in the world itself. The experience of meaning, they'd argue, can be entirely a property of the observing mind, without needing a theory about reality itself organizing around significance. This is a serious position, and it's one many working scientists hold. Jung's response, consistently, was that he wasn't claiming certainty either way. He described synchronicity as a hypothesis, a working concept for a category of experience that existing frameworks didn't account for well, not as a proven law of nature. That distinction is worth sitting with, because it's often lost in how the idea gets discussed now. Jung wasn't asking anyone to believe the universe sends personal messages. He was asking a narrower, more careful question. Is there a category of human experience, rare, specific, intensely psychological, that our standard explanatory tools genuinely struggle with? And if so, what's the most honest way to describe it? Whether or not you accept his particular answer, that's a legitimate question, and it's one that serious thinkers, including at least one Nobel Prize-winning physicist, thought was worth taking seriously. With that context in place, the last thing worth covering is what any of this actually means for how you might think about meaningful coincidence in your own life. Not as proof of anything mystical, but as a genuinely useful lens either way. Whatever you personally conclude about whether synchronicity describes something real in the world, or something real only about human psychology, there's a genuinely useful way to carry this idea forward, one that doesn't require settling the unresolved scientific debate first. Start with the most defensible version of what Jung was pointing to, the one even skeptics can mostly agree on. Meaningful coincidences, whatever ultimately causes them, tend to cluster around moments of real psychological significance. That's true almost by definition. A coincidence only registers as meaningful to you if it connects to something you're already carrying weight around. This gives the idea practical value, even under the most skeptical possible reading. When something coincidental strikes you as unusually significant, that reaction itself is information, regardless of whether the coincidence has any deeper explanation. It's often pointing you toward whatever's genuinely active in your unconscious at that moment. An unresolved question, a decision you're avoiding, a change you're already sensing but haven't consciously named yet. This reframes the practical use of the idea in a way that sidesteps the unfalsifiability problem almost entirely. You don't need to resolve whether the universe is organizing events around meaning. You only need to notice that your own mind is flagging something as significant and treat that flag as worth investigating. The same way you'd treat a strong, disproportionate reaction to another person, which we discussed in an earlier video, as worth investigating rather than dismissing. Here's how that looks in practice. When a coincidence strikes you, a specific thought followed closely by a specific event, an idea surfacing repeatedly from unrelated directions. Instead of immediately deciding it's either fate or nothing, ask what it's actually connected to in your own life right now. What were you thinking about, worrying about, or avoiding right before it happened? Often the coincidence isn't really about the external event at all. It's a kind of psychological spotlight, drawing your attention to something that was already sitting there, unexamined, waiting for a reason to surface. This is also where the honest skepticism from earlier genuinely matters rather than just being a disclaimer. If you start treating every minor